Now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and we're going to cover a number of different topics over the next couple of hours, so I hope you'll stay tuned for each one of those. In just a minute, we're going to have a conversation about an opportunity for many of you to maybe study at a place like Oxford University, and we want to talk about what is available there at what is called Wycliffe Hall at Oxford, and it fits very much to some of the conversations we've had in the past. In studio with us, we've had Dr. Peter Williams of Tyndale House at Cambridge. This is now, of course, going to Oxford, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. At the bottom of the hour, we're going to get back into some of the issues in the news, and there's been a real promotion right now by this administration for a bill to actually fund infrastructure. I'm going to talk about the fact that a lot of what is called infrastructure is not, but also in the process of promoting it, I think we have now learned that President Joe Biden not only wants to actually certainly try to repeal all sorts of laws passed in the past, I think he wants to even repeal the laws of physics. He said some things that caused a lot of people to raise their eyebrows. And so maybe I'll just give you a little bit of the background from whether or not even that kind of thing can happen, given just the basic laws of physics and chemistry. We'll give you kind of an update as well on the ongoing controversy of the 60 Minutes smear against the governor of Florida, and a very interesting piece by a very prominent liberal who, nevertheless, the title of this is, "When Will Liberals Reclaim Free Speech?" He says, even though I'm a liberal, and even though I am certainly calling for free speech, oftentimes even though I am certainly anything but a right-winger, that's how I get labeled, because the university today doesn't really seem to be very interested in free speech. And so, if nothing else, I want you to know there's some people that, even though they might disagree with many of the things we talk about around the table, they would agree with us that we need a robust debate, and that includes free speech. Anyway, let's, if we can, get to the first topic that I wanted to put on the table before we get to many of those articles we've posted as well, and that is to bring Dr. Justyn Terry to the microphone. He is the Vice President and Academic Dean for Wycliffe Hall, which is at Oxford. I think you're going to really enjoy the conversation here, and of course he has also served as a professor of systematic theology, an individual that at one time was a physics teacher, might even appreciate some of the things I'm going to share a little bit later in the next hour. But if nothing else, joins us now to talk about how there really is kind of an open door there in this particular hall at Oxford. So, Dr. Terry, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, Kerby, thank you very much for having me on. Great to be with you.
Talk about what is taking place there at Oxford. I have always wanted to encourage some of our bright students and those who maybe even want to go for a postgraduate degree to consider going to St. Andrews, Cambridge, Oxford, whatever it might be. Talk about some of the opportunities, because they are pretty significant.
Well, they really are, and it's a great privilege to be able to share this news with all your listeners. So basically, Wycliffe Hall, amazingly enough, is a Christian college, Bible-believing tutors, faculty members, part of the University of Oxford. As far as we know, that's a pretty unique thing in any country of the world. But to have that kind of opportunity to take the programs that are available through the University of Oxford, but in a setting where you've got Bible-believing tutors, we do believe that's a unique opportunity that we haven't really let be widely publicised for whatever reason in the past. We're trying to get the word out now and say, look, there are great opportunities here, right the way from a certificate program that I wanted to say a bit more about, this Theologos program, right the way through to a doctorate. So we have people studying the whole range of courses, right the way from certificate, diploma, bachelor's degree, master's, through to a doctorate. And we have them living in a community of Christian believers and others who want to be part of that kind of Christian world, and it's, we think, a great opportunity for people all around the world.
Let me just mention that we do have a link, and it's kind of detailed, but you can just simply follow the link that we have provided, or else you can type out wycliffe.ox.ac.uk. Well, you don't have to go through all that because we've made it easy for you. But the other day we had actually president of a Christian university, and they had a virtual tour that was available. And let me, if I can, Dr. Terry, point out that if people scroll down far enough, they will see a virtual tour. So if some people are saying, This is something I might be interested in, but I want to get a little more detail, especially since I recognize it may be grandparents and parents listening about this right now, although some of them might even be thinking about going there themselves. This gives them a little bit of an overview of what it really looks like. So can you give us an idea of what indeed is entailing when individuals end up at Oxford?
So the whole range of things going on across this university, tens of thousands of students here, and then any course you can imagine is available somewhere around the university. Here at Wycliffe, we really focus on theology. Some people are doing philosophy, but basically our main programs here are very much in the field of theology. And so what we're able to say to people, and again, it's a whole range of ages. In fact, we don't take 18-year-old undergraduates. We really take mature students, so normally 21 and above. Generally, people have already got a degree in another program before they arrive here. And a lot of people here are training for some form of Christian ministry, maybe ordained ministry, maybe lay ministry, teaching ministry, all sorts of different ministries. So people arrive and they take the course that's the next step for them.
And again, one of the things I appreciate is you have it broken down. If you have no prior theological degree, you have this one track. If you have a prior theological degree, then how many years of study can you give to that and a variety of others? So really, there are so many opportunities, and I really want people to consider this because we really need to emphasize in the evangelical world the idea of the mind, especially developing a Christian mind. And so I want to encourage some of the best and the brightest. They may have just graduated from college. They may have actually been in ministry for many years to consider this because this will have them, in a sense, face-to-face with some of the interviews that we do here on Point of View, but to actually be sitting across from some of those individuals or hearing lectures from those individuals is going to be pretty exciting.
Well, it is very exciting, and one of the particularly exciting things at the moment, we have probably one of the best-known Bible teachers in the world, Tom Wright, here as a senior research fellow. So you get a chance to have lunch with people of that kind of distinction. And so it is an extraordinary opportunity, and it's certainly the case that there's all sorts of graduate programs here, and we've got a wonderful graduate society, so you get a chance to present papers in an environment which is very conducive, building up faith, wanting people to be people of faith in the theological world. So putting the theology very seriously, obviously high-level theology, but also faith and practice and really living out the faith, not just thinking about it.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about a couple of other aspects of that study and just kind of what's happening over there in the UK. And I think if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more, one of the reasons I wanted to do this from time to time is we want to encourage you at whatever level. If you're graduating from high school, we've talked about some of these Christian colleges that may be a great place for you to study. If you have already graduated, maybe you've even been in ministry for 10, 20 years, and you're starting to think mid-career you want to do something different, or you would like to add on to some of the things you've studied. Just wanted you to know about that. So we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation for just a few more minutes with Dr. Justyn Terry. And if you would like to ask a question before we let him go, give us a call. That number is 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. Then we're going to get into all sorts of issues in the news. And just as a program note, an hour from now, we'll have Michael Card with us as we'll be talking about his new book and his music. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Michael Schellenberger has been working in the environmental arena for decades, but he began to become more concerned when he was hearing claims that billions of people are going to die unless we implement radical draconian environmental policies. Early on in his book, he explains why he decided to part company with some of the environmentalists and set the record straight. He said much of what people are being told about the environment, including the climate, is wrong, and we desperately need to get it right. I decided to write Apocalypse Never after getting fed up with the exaggeration, alarmism, and extremism that are the enemies of positive, humanistic, and rational environmentalism. He explains that carbon emissions peaked and have actually been declining in most developed countries. Deaths from extreme weather, even in poor countries, have been declining significantly, and while he admits that climate change may have contributed to the fires in California and elsewhere, it is not the cause of them. His concern is that this singular emphasis on climate change has distracted us from more pressing environmental issues. Extreme poverty, underdevelopment, and land use are just a few of the many concerns often ignored when we focus all of our attention on climate change. He also admitted that he began as an anti-nuclear activist. Now he has changed his mind. He talks about the war on nuclear and explains how nuclear energy provides a significant amount of power without adding carbon dioxide to the environment. He concludes by acknowledging that climate change is real and that it's not the end of the world. Pundits and politicians who are scaring people about climate change need to read his book. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And again, we've been talking with Dr. Justyn Terry, who's the Vice Principal and Academic Dean at Wycliffe College, Wycliffe Hall, which is at Oxford, and an individual that was really just kind of educating us a little bit more about what might be available. And just before we went to the break, Dr. Terry, you mentioned, of course, N.T. Wright. Professor N.T. Wright's been on the program with us a number of times over different books that he has written. And he is, of course, one of the individuals that people could actually study with and hear lectures from. But one of the arguments that N.T. Wright has made is that theology should not be done in isolation, and it really needs to be done in community. And what I understand is there at Oxford, and especially at Wycliffe Hall, you have a very vibrant community that allows people to kind of think through and work through their theological ideas. Isn't that true?
That's exactly right. So each day we have a chapel service, then there are lectures and meal times are together, and you'll have a chance to talk with professors over the meal times and other times of day. But we have put together a special program, particularly to attract more international students to come, at least for a one-year program. And this is the Theologos program. And for that, we encourage people to come to chapel each day. We have a reading group where that group of students, we groups of up to 12, have a chance to read some of the great apologists, often Oxford apologists like C.S. Lewis, Dorothy L. Sayers, and others. And then we do a chance to sit with some of the great thinkers like N.T. Wright, having a chance to have fireside chats with people of that distinction every couple of weeks, and other educational visits. It's a very rich community life, and we really think it's a great way to think deeply about the Christian faith.
Well, let's talk about the one thing that's in everybody's mind. We've been going through a COVID-19, and we've been dealing with a pandemic, and we've been hearing about even the UK variant and some other things. So some people are going to say, well, if maybe next fall I'd like to make my way to Oxford, what are the circumstances and what is the possibility that I could actually attend in person? Can you give us some perspective there?
I can. Well, what we're doing even this coming term, so just in a couple of weeks' time, we'll be meeting in class. In fact, a local church has let us use their space. You can sit 2 meters apart, wear a mask, keep yourself completely safe, and we'll be able to do our lectures in that kind of format. We are hoping that as the vaccine program continues to spread, we're going to be able to move increasingly towards more normal behavior. You may have heard that Britain is hoping to return to normality in June. Well, it may be July, it may be August, but hopefully by September, October time, it's going to look a lot more like normal. So we are hoping and praying that next academic year, will really be a much more normal student experience.
I'm sure you are ready to get out of lockdown. I know we are as well. And I certainly know the UK has struggled quite a bit with various issues of lockdown and the impact that that's had, and then a breakout again and all sorts of other concerns. So if people are saying, okay, you've got me somewhat interested, and I'm hoping that maybe this is something we indeed could do, and I'm ready to go and study, what's the first step? How do they go about that? Or if they want to ask questions when they go to the website and they hit that button that says connect or support or something like that, can they even call you or send an email or learn a little bit more about some of this?
Absolutely, yeah. So I encourage you to go to the website. You'll see a little video there. It gives you a bit of a broader explanation of the Theologos program in particular, but all sorts of other things we're doing here. And you'll find emails, email addresses. You're certainly welcome to contact me. We've also got someone called Meredith Ainley, who herself is from Arkansas. She is our particularly focused American representative, and so she'd be very happy to get in touch with people as well and just to answer questions. We love to spend time with people, think it through, and really make sure it's the right fit for them. So please do be in touch. Be thrilled to be in touch and talk things through with you.
And again, you talked about a one-year University of Oxford course, the Theologos program, so that is one to consider, as well as some other opportunities. I know that there's a virtual open day. There are some videos that to give you a little bit of a virtual tour, so we've tried to provide as much of the information there as possible, but if they want more information, just go to the website. Is that right?
Absolutely. Go to the website, be in touch with us. We'd love to have those kind of questions. And you can come for the 1 year. It can go from there. You can develop from the 1 year program to second and third years if all goes well. You can come here for gap year, sabbatical year, all sorts of different ways. Get yourself equipped for a better witness in the workplace. All sorts of opportunities. People of all ages and backgrounds come, and we love it when we have people from the States and around the world come and join us.
Well, Dr. Justyn Terry, thank you so very much for sharing that. When I heard about it, I thought this might be something that would interest a number of the individuals that listen to this program. As you said, it could be a gap year program before you go into graduate level. It could be one of you who have been involved in ministry for many years, but you find yourself saying, maybe I'd like to get a little bit additional study, or maybe some of you are looking for a theological degree or some other kind of degree or philosophy degree. Certainly wanted you to know that exists. And again, we talk about the life of the mind around here, and this was one more opportunity I wanted to place front and center for you. So, Dr. Justyn Terry, thank you very much for joining us, and look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to meeting some of the folks who are listening this very day.
Let's, if we can, just before we take a break, I thought I might mention something real quickly, and that is, as we were talking about this idea of infrastructure, as you well know, already spent $1.9 trillion on what is supposed to be stimulus, and of course, a lot of people wonder how much is there. Now we have, it used to be a $2 trillion infrastructure bill. Now it's $2.5 trillion. Matter of fact, I taped a commentary that'll air next week in which I pointed out that I said at least $2 trillion because I knew it would happen. I was guessing right that indeed there were some people saying, well, it shouldn't be $2 trillion. Some were saying $4 trillion. And then you had Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, so could not be outdone. So she suggested $10 trillion. So anyway, we're at $2.5 trillion. And of course, then you've got to promote this. So not to be outdone, President Joe Biden decided to do so. And this piece from Jim Garrity, you can't ignore physics, Joe. He says Joe Biden is not any different from Donald Trump in his propensity to just blurt out the first thing that pops into his mind, whether or not it's true, whether or not even sounds plausible, whether or not he's even describing something that violates the law of physics. This one is so incredible, I think even Donald Trump would be looking at that going, really? This isn't even possible. Because he began to talk about the fact that if nothing else, he wants us to be able to travel coast to coast without a single tank of gas on a high-speed train close to as fast as you can go across the country in an airplane. Okay, so we want trains now to go as fast as an airplane. Okay, I'm going to give you a little bit of physics. If any of my science teachers are listening here, they might say, hey, maybe this guy finally learned something. A commercial airliner travels at 550 miles an hour, sometimes up to 580 miles an hour. The fastest train that's ever been tested 370 miles an hour. And frankly, when you get into the so-called bullet trains in Japan, that's about 200 miles an hour. So the president wants us to actually have trains that will travel 1.5 times faster than the fastest train on the planet so far. And there are some other problems with that. The reason you don't want to travel too fast is every once in a while you have to go around a curve. Now, if you ever took physics, you might remember that there's a thing called centrifugal force, okay? And centrifugal force, again, trust me on this one, is the function of the square of the train's velocity divided by the radius of the curve. Okay, you don't have to know all of Physics 101, but that is the case. So that means the tighter the curve, the more likely the train will go flying off the curve. This is another reason why when you go around a curve in an interstate, sometimes it's slightly banked. Any NASCAR fans out there, those are usually banked a lot more because those cars are going a lot faster. Now, there's, of course, a couple of other problems, too, because you've had all sorts of train derailments. And just recently we had one in Taiwan where it ended up killing 50 people. That train was going 75 miles an hour, not 500 miles an hour, not even 350 miles an hour. It was going 75 miles an hour, so you can kind of see the problem there. He also said that he was really excited about the fact that we could develop planes that could take you from coast to coast in an hour. Okay, I've got a problem with that one, too, because in order to do that, matter of fact, to give you his quote here, he says, if we decide to do it and traverse the world in about an hour, travel 21,000 miles an hour. Now, even if you're talking about a supersonic plane, that'd be like the Concorde. Again, even the fastest spy plane I can come up with is the Blackbird, and that's 2,000 miles per hour. Joe Biden wants it to go 21,000 miles an hour. And there is a point in which I understand the desire on the part of Joe Biden and the Biden administration to try to overturn some of the previous laws under Donald Trump. But I do recommend that it might be a lot more difficult to overturn the laws of physics. Anyway, thought I'd have some fun with that. And maybe you learned a little bit about physics. We're going to take a break. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Do want to talk about this infrastructure bill, but I thought, if nothing else, another good time when we should have kept the microphones on during the break, because we're talking about driving around on a NASCAR track, which you can do and volunteer to do so, and why it is really important to have banked turns if you're going to be traveling at that speed. Because again, if you're just simply going around one of these turns at 50 miles an hour, banking is not so important. If you're traveling at 200 miles an hour, you better hope you have banking, or you're going to have some difficulties. And it gets back to the conversation we had just a minute ago, where President Joe Biden really trying to build a vision for really having an incredible infrastructure. But the problem with this is that pretty soon, even though he wants to repeal some of the laws passed during the Trump administration, don't think you can repeal the laws of physics, and certainly that is the case. And you can imagine the crash that took place in Taiwan at 75 miles an hour. Of course, we had another one a while back, which was a crash of a train in Spain, and that was traveling about 100 miles an hour. But imagine if you're traveling at those speeds, that would be very dangerous. And Jim Garrity points out something else. If you're thinking, hey, wouldn't a train going 500 miles an hour, 550 miles an hour be a tempting target for a terrorist? The answer is yes. And we have seen, he's documented 282 different attempts to deliberately derail trains, and a number of other, I think 817 additional attacks on railway infrastructure. So there are some real concerns about having trains travel too fast. For our listeners in California, maybe you could educate us about how that high-speed train is doing so well in California. What a boondoggle that one has been. But then, again, this one, Jim Garrity has some fun with this, because he talks about the fact that even when we had the Concorde, which for those of you that are younger, you might not even know what that is, but that was the supersonic passenger airplane. And you had that on the West. The Soviets also had one as well. And they traveled at about 1,300 miles an hour. I think the Soviet one got up to 1,600 miles an hour. But when you have Joe Biden having a vision for a passenger aircraft that can traverse the world in about an hour, in other words, travel at 21,000 miles an hour, Jim Garrity had a little bit of fun for that. He said, anybody that says that we should eventually create an airplane that could travel at 21,000 miles an hour, maybe that's a strong argument for mandatory drug testing in the White House, given the fact that really kind of the most famous spy plane that I can think of, the Blackbird, traveled at 2,100, not 21,000. We can have fun with that all day, but those are interesting where we roll our eyes and say, really? But we have to also recognize that right now this is being promoted as an infrastructure bill. Now, there's a reason for that. When you do any kind of market testing, many times Americans are hesitant about spending more money, but the word infrastructure is something that appeals to both Republicans and Democrats and independents, conservatives and liberals and all the rest. So there's no surprise that this particular bill being promoted right now, and again, it's like listening to an auction. Do we have $2 trillion? Do I hear $2.5 trillion? It's just going up and up and up. But one of the pieces that I've posted for you to read, it's actually our second article here, is actually entitled, Biden's Infrastructure Plan Isn't About Infrastructure, It's About Paying Off Political Allies. And the argument that this particular author makes is that only about 7% of this $2.5 trillion dollars being proposed relates to infrastructure. Now, when I wrote my commentary this last week, and it will air next week, I said 5%, but it's still within the order of magnitude. And then I did point out that there are others, like the White House, that were saying, well, yeah, but if you add some other things, you can get that up to a quarter. Somebody, using the most generous assumptions I can possibly imagine, actually argues that maybe half of the bill could be considered infrastructure. And so you're getting the sense that we're being played. This is not just a one-time only infrastructure bill. This is a bill called infrastructure, so we can, again, stick as many ornaments on this Christmas tree as possible. And as more and more people are starting to see the criticism of this being called an infrastructure bill, instead of backing off and saying, wait a minute, okay, it's infrastructure and other things, what we saw the other day, and this is in the article I've posted for you to read, because when I first saw it, I said, nah, this has got to be Babylon Bee. This has got to be The Onion. There's no way this is a true statement. Oh, yes, it is. This comes from the senator from New York, Kirsten Gillibrand. Her tweet says, paid leave is infrastructure. Child care is infrastructure. Caregiving is infrastructure. You get the point. When everything is infrastructure, really, of course, nothing is infrastructure. And so I wanted to post this piece for you to understand that over the next couple of weeks, there is going to be such a drumbeat for the fact that we should be concerned about the crumbling roads, bridges, and other things in our society. And we need to spend money once in a lifetime, as we're being told, for this infrastructure bill, which was $2 trillion. Now it's $2.5 trillion. There was somebody suggesting $4 trillion. I bet by next week it'll be $4 trillion. I don't think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is going to get her $10 trillion, but nevertheless, I am convinced that most of the members of Congress absolutely are convinced that money does grow on trees, and they're going to turn our money into monopoly money. And whether you accept the Republicans' 5%, 7%, whether you accept the White House's 25%, or one of these apologists for the Biden administration that started counting all sorts of other things and gets it up to almost 50%, you still have to recognize a lot of this has nothing to do by any stretch of the imagination about infrastructure. For example, because you might want to know what those are, $400 billion for expanding health care, $213 billion for affordable housing, research, training, and development programs. And there's $50 billion for the National Science Foundation. There's $50 billion for the Department of Commerce. And there's what's called the PRO Act, which you probably have heard a little bit about today because the AFL-CIO today has been kind of promoting the so-called PRO Act, which would actually make it harder for workers who want to stay out of the unions. And so, again, you can certainly see that this is going to spend a lot of money, which brings me to the last obvious question. Who's going to pay for it? Now, the argument has always been from this administration when they were running for office, the candidates, and that was first Joe Biden, and then later when Kamala Harris was picked as his vice presidential running mate, then she got on board. She criticized it before, but then she got on board saying, we're not going to actually raise the taxes of anybody who makes more than $400,000 a year. Now they're going back and saying, no, we meant $400,000 per family, not $400,000 for individuals. So all of a sudden they're lowering the numbers. The numbers are going to go further down. And of course, they've spent a fair amount of time arguing that much of this will go to changing the corporate income tax back to where it was before Donald Trump and the Congress changed that, which would, of course, make it less competitive. And again, if you haven't figured this out by now, if we raise the corporate income taxes, guess who gets to pay for it? Well, you do, of course. And so there is going to be quite a bit there as well. And it's also quite theoretically possible that some of those tax hikes don't make their way through. Because what I've seen happen many times is we have the spending bill go through, but the tax cuts and the change in the tax hikes and all those kinds of things are going to maybe not make their way through. And so in that case, then you spend trillions of dollars and you aren't paying for it. And so what happens? Well, we're going to talk about that next week with the Federal Reserve in terms of how our national debt goes even higher, and how, since no foreign country wants to buy our treasuries anymore, why would you? I think it's 0.8% for a 2-year treasury. So guess who buys them? Well, the Fed does. Well, in order to do that, somebody has to print the money. Well, the Treasury prints the money, and we're back to the same old situation where we are creating more dollars for the same amount of goods and services. And that means, I think most of you understand what that probably means, but if not, as we go to a break, it means the dollars in your purse or your wallet or your pocketbook next year aren't worth what they are today. So either way, this is not necessarily good, especially since it's being sold as dealing with infrastructure. And I think any fair-minded person looking at this has to say, yeah, there's some infrastructure pieces in this, and there's a whole lot more that has nothing to do with infrastructure, unless you're Senator Gillibrand, and then you're saying everything's infrastructure. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, just a few more minutes, and then next hour we'll have Michael Card with us. Just as a program note, let me just mention tomorrow will be our weekend edition, and we'll get into some of these other issues in the news for the entire time, and we'll have Penna Dexter with us and Dr. Merrill Matthews, so those will be some conversations tomorrow. And if you'd like to join us, certainly we'll get into a variety of other topics we haven't addressed and others that we haven't mentioned in the last couple of days. One of those, of course, what's happening at the border, so we will get into that. But first of all, I thought just before we run out of time today, I would go back to our very first article. This is by Katie Pavlich. The 60-minute smear of DeSantis keeps getting worse. Why do we keep bringing it up? Well, first of all, we're learning how deceptive some of this really was. But if you look through the history of kind of modern journalism, you think of the pantheon of individuals that are well respected. Edward R. Murrow, Walter Cronkite. I mean, we have various awards being given in their names. I just the other day mentioned the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at ASU and things like that. You think of programs like Nightline. Did I agree with everything on Nightline? No, but I think Ted Koppel did a pretty good job of trying to be fair. You think of all the talking head shows on Sunday, Meet the Press, and a variety of others that all fit into that category, and one that was almost always in that category as well was 60 Minutes. There's some times when 60 Minutes really dropped the ball? Sure. Did I disagree with some of the things that were said, the way the questions were asked? Yes, of course. But what has happened over this last week has been, I think, a very significant criticism of 60 Minutes. And it illustrates again the fact that when you make such a horrible mistake, when it is obviously so biased, you would expect, and we're all going to be watching on Sunday to see if there's any comment about that on 60 Minutes, but maybe not. And this article takes you through some of this in a little bit more detail so that you can read it and just understand why, again, we encourage you to listen to Point of View and not every time even agree with everything you hear on Point of View. We put a lot of these articles up so you can read them for yourself and so that you can interact with them. We open up the phones for people to disagree with us because we are seeking truth, even sometimes when we don't like the truth, but it's just the facts of life. And this one is such an incredible example of media bias, media malpractice, whatever you want to say. And so I'm only going to read two pieces of this. One comes from the Democratic mayor of Palm Beach County. That's Dave Kerner, in which he actually believes that they intentionally clipped out some of the things being said by Governor Ron DeSantis. And he put this, and this is in a full quote. He said, "I watched the 60 Minutes segment on Palm Beach County last week and felt compelled to issue this statement. The reporting was not just based on bad information, it was intentionally false." That's quite a comment coming from a Democrat who, on some cases, probably doesn't necessarily agree with the governor. He says, "I know this because I offered to provide my insight into the Palm Beach County's vaccination efforts, and 60 Minutes declined. They know that the governor came to Palm Beach County and met with me and the county administrator, and we asked to expand the state's partnership with Publix to Palm Beach County. We also discussed our own local plans to expand mass vaccination centers throughout the county, which the governor has been incredibly supportive. We asked, and he delivered. They had that information. They left it out because it kneecaps their narrative." He goes on a little bit later to say, "We have confronted this pandemic for over a year. Our residents, like Americans, are tired, and the media is making it worse. They are hell-bent on dividing us for cheap views and clicks. 60 Minutes should be ashamed." Now, this comes from a Democratic mayor in Florida about what was taking place. And the other person who also was very upset was the Democratic individual who is involved as the, I think he's called the Emergency Management, and I'm not sure his actual title because it's not listed here. It was the other day. And he used some words about this that I really can't use on radio, so use your imagination, because he said at one point 60 Minutes was saying, as Jared Moskowitz, they said, "Well, no, we talked with him." And he says, wait, I did speak to 60 Minutes. Never I never said I didn't. They were very nice. I told him the public story was, and then he uses some words we don't use in mixed company. Then I walked him through the whole process, but he points out that they were saying he didn't sit down for the camera interview, and he said, well, that's because guess what? I was responding to a 100-year emergency. Doesn't change the truth. He did, as we can now find out, offer to actually sit down for the interview, but they said, well, that was past our deadline. So they found it to be a very convenient way to simply ignore some of the facts. And this piece, which goes on for 2 pages, illustrates why 60 Minutes, which used to be so valuable and used to be mostly trusted, not always around this table, we don't understand that, but now has really, in a sense, embarrassed themselves dramatically. And I just wanted to mention it one more time because a lot of people say, what media bias? I think this is going to be one, frankly, for the textbooks, but we'll see how that plays out. Just before we take a break, one other piece. This is our second article here. When will liberals reclaim free speech? This comes from Justyn Zimmerman. He is actually a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Ivy League school, and he simply says, what happens is sometimes his students will say, Professor, why are you so conservative about free speech? He says, several students have asked me versions of this question recently, which speaks volumes about universities right now. He says, I'm a liberal and a Democrat. I'm pro-choice, pro-Obamacare, and vehemently anti-Trump. But I'm also a strong supporter of free speech, which marks me as a right-winger on campus. This is a person that everybody would consider as your kind of liberal's liberal, but because he believes in free speech, what is going on here? He says that's because our fellow liberals have largely abandoned free speech to conservatives. Turn on Fox News, you'll see cancel culture decried in bright lights. But in the liberal press and most of us in the liberal academy, free speech has become the rhetorical third rail. Third rail meaning you touch it, you get killed. Sure, we'll invoke it when Republican state lawmakers try to ban critical race theory, but in our own house, free speech is seen increasingly as a tool of repression because the argument is oftentimes that it's racist. And he says, once you decide to swing the censorship hammer against racist speech, almost anything else looks like a nail, he says. A business school professor who discusses a Chinese word that sounds like an American slur gets canceled. A law professor who says that her African-American students underachieve academically, she gets in trouble. A math professor who criticizes diversity training, he gets in trouble as well. And he says, look, I get it. You don't need a weatherman to know which way the free speech winds are blowing these days. It's prudent to keep your big mouth shut. But that's an anathema to the liberal university, which requires debating differences fully and openly. He ends his piece, and you can read it because it goes on for 3 pages. I'm glad that conservatives have embraced free speech, but I would also like to see my fellow liberals reclaim it. We need the courage to speak up again for free speech, which remains the best vehicle for righting the wrongs of America. Well, again, I would have to say, Justyn Zimmerman, thank you for joining the group. You may be a liberal. We may disagree on just about everything we talk about around this table, but at least we can agree on one thing. We need free speech, and it doesn't exist on your campus. It doesn't exist on most university campuses. It hardly exists even in the media. And so if nothing else, we want to be an alternative to that right here at Point of View. If you want to find some of these articles I've been running through, they are all available on our website, pointofview.net. If you want to know more about the conversation we're going to have with Michael Card in his book, well, that's there as well. So visit the website, pointofview.net, and think about joining the Truth Team. We're committed to truth. We know you are, and I hope you'll support this ministry. And you can find that at the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, I want to spend a little bit of time, first of all, talking about my commentary today. It is entitled Apocalypse Never. That is actually the title of a book. It's written by Michael Schellenberger, and I would have done an interview with him, but Dr. Merrill Matthews did one a while back, and so certainly that is worth your opportunity to go back and maybe find out more about the book or about that interview. But I did want to focus on it because I also recognize that in addition to this push right now for infrastructure, a good portion of that infrastructure bill is an attempt to kind of push forward what might be considered the Green New Deal. One of the reasons why, by the way, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is talking about this idea of actually spending $10 trillion because she wants to spend more on this issue of climate change. Well, let me give you some perspective on this commentary, if nothing else, because it might be something you might want to read, either the commentary or perhaps the book. I have a copy of the book and made it a point to spend some time with various parts of the book. I might even go into more of the detail in future commentaries, but you've got to recognize that he comes to this as an environmentalist. And it is always helpful sometimes when we can quote from someone who otherwise would probably be promoting kind of a radical environmental agenda, but as common sense breaks out, goes, wait a minute. And what happened is even though he was sort of an environmental activist, he said he began to be more concerned about hearing claims, especially heard those a couple of years ago, that billions of people are going to die unless we implement radical, draconian environmental policies. You've seen this before. As a matter of fact, if you have my booklet on climate change, before I get into some of the issues of climate change, I give you some of the very radical, over-the-top predictions made in the late 1960s, early 1970s about billions of people dying. Of course, it never happened. But nevertheless, he started seeing the same kind of thing happening in kind of the last decade. And so early on in his book, he began to explain why he actually wrote the book. And let me just quote from him, because I used it in the commentary. One of his paragraphs is which he said, "Much of what people are being told about the environment, including the climate, is wrong, and we desperately need to get it right." He said, "I decided to write Apocalypse Never after getting fed up with the exaggeration, alarmism, and extremism that is the enemy of positive, humanistic, and rational environmentalism." Now, again, comes to his conclusions in a different way than those of us as Christians might, but at the same time, he then goes through the book and details a lot. I'm just in the commentary summarizing a few. One, for example, that carbon emissions actually have peaked and have actually been declining in many developed countries. Now, some of that was happening even before the pandemic and lockdown. It's happened a lot more, which gets me to my commentary from yesterday, which I'll get to in just a minute if we have some time. But then also points out that death from extreme weather, even in our poor countries, have significantly declined. And while there's always the attempt to blame everything from hurricanes to fires in California and Australia for climate change, he will say, as an individual that still has a lot of his environmental perspective, that certainly climate change might have contributed to those fires, but they certainly are not the cause of them, and goes into a whole chapter explaining that in more detail. But his biggest concern actually comes outside of that, because he says that what has happened is when we've had this exclusive emphasis upon climate change, it's really distracted from what he feels are more pressing environmental issues. That would be things like extreme poverty, which we've talked about on this program, underdevelopment, land use, and a number of others, which then don't get the kind of attention they deserve because there's been such an extreme focus on simply climate change. Then, in one of the chapters, which probably makes his fellow environmentalists most upset, he actually talks about the war on nuclear. Now, again, he came into the environmental movement as an anti-nuclear activist, and now he's changed his mind. He talks about the war on nuclear, explains how really, if you want to actually provide enough power, nuclear energy is about the best way we have right now in terms of providing enough power without adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So it is interesting that whether you look at Bill Gates, I quoted him a couple weeks ago, and people said, I can't believe you're quoting Bill Gates. I am, because Bill Gates is kind of into the whole climate change issue. And if you read through Bill Gates' book, and I have, what you will find is he's hoping for all sorts of breakthroughs that will have to happen in order to even come close to getting a carbon zero in the future. Many of those breakthroughs, by the way, in light of the conversation we had last hour, might require us to break the laws of chemistry and physics, but we'll leave that on another day. But it's interesting that whether you have an environmental activist like Bjorn Lomborg or Michael Schellenberger, or whether you have an individual that has been really believing that climate change is a disaster and trying to find technological solutions, as Bill Gates, they're all kind of running into some problems. And those problems come with the fact that you just can't necessarily get there from here without some remarkable changes. And since we were talking about airplanes, just before we take a break, and then I'll get into another commentary, Bill Gates points out that, one of the biggest questions for him is airplane travel. I mean, after all, he owns a jet company. And he's saying, obviously, we can't power jets and airplanes with solar power. Now, again, Dr. Merrill Matthews will be with me tomorrow. Always likes to point out, yeah, but they do have some of these solar-powered planes, yes, and 1 or 2 people can fly in them. No, we're talking about commercial airlines. And it brings me to an interesting conversation that Bill Gates talks about in his book between Warren Buffett and Bill Gates. Because Warren Buffett was saying, okay, I recognize, we have to get the power ahead of time, but why can't we just have all these solar panels, charge all these batteries, and then put these batteries on the plane? At which point, then just kind of doing a back-of-the-envelope kind of calculation that Bill Gates uses. Okay, here's the efficiency of the batteries. Here is the weight of each one of the batteries. The batteries for an airplane to possibly be able to get off the ground would be bigger, heavier, and larger than the airplane itself. I mean, there are just some basic laws of physics you just can't overcome. I know the current president thinks we can, but nevertheless, that is, I think, an illustration of what many of these people are facing. And so Michael Schellenberger, still has kind of an environmental issue, and he recognizes that, he says, climate change is real, and quite frankly, the climate has changed. It's gotten warmer since we came out of a little ice age, but he says it's not the end of the world, and this is why he calls it apocalypse never, because he got so convinced that everybody was believing in apocalypse now. And here is an individual that once he started looking at the facts, started using some common sense, said, wait a minute, maybe we need to back up a little bit here. And that's why I did the commentary on that today. When we come back from a break, I thought I might talk a little bit about my commentary yesterday, because, again, I haven't really talked about it on air, but it's a reminder again of what many people in the environmental movement need to take place if they're going to really get anything close to a lower carbon net. And they're talking about lockdowns. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Michael Schellenberger has been working in the environmental arena for decades, but he began to become more concerned when he was hearing claims that billions of people are going to die unless we implement radical draconian environmental policies. Early on in his book, he explains why he decided to part company with some of the environmentalists and set the record straight. He said much of what people are being told about the environment, including the climate, is wrong, and we desperately need to get it right. I decided to write Apocalypse Never after getting fed up with the exaggeration, alarmism, and extremism that are the enemies of positive, humanistic, and rational environmentalism. He explains that carbon emissions peaked and have actually been declining in most developed countries. Deaths from extreme weather, even in poor countries, have been declining significantly, and while he admits that climate change may have contributed to the fires in California and elsewhere, it is not the cause of them. His concern is that this singular emphasis on climate change has distracted us from more pressing environmental issues. Extreme poverty, underdevelopment, and land use are just a few of the many concerns often ignored when we focus all of our attention on climate change. He also admitted that he began as an anti-nuclear activist. Now he has changed his mind. He talks about the war on nuclear and explains how nuclear energy provides a significant amount of power without adding carbon dioxide to the environment. He concludes by acknowledging that climate change is real and that it's not the end of the world. Pundits and politicians who are scaring people about climate change need to read his book. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, stay on the topic for just another minute or two on this issue of climate change. And again, we have already talked a little bit about this whole issue of Apocalypse Never. But yesterday's commentary was also sort of on climate. I thought I would just cover it real briefly because I call it climate lockdown. And it turns out that if you've been reading the literature, and I've kind of dug into this because I think one of the big issues we're going to be dealing with is this issue of climate change, the Green New Deal, and what might be pushed through in some cases related to this infrastructure bill. And as a result, what you're starting to see, not so much in this country, although there have been a few comments, but mostly in other countries, have been this idea that actually because of the lockdown that we had to do because of the pandemic, this would be a perfect test run for a new climate-driven lockdown for the economy. If you're convinced that carbon dioxide is dangerous and methane is dangerous, then anything that slows down any kind of production of CO2 or methane, then that is certainly the case. And these are seen as greenhouse gases. Now, I can go into all the technical aspects of whether or not we're already kind of reaching equilibrium with CO2, and even if we put more in the atmosphere, whether it's going to lead to any more increase in temperature, but we'll leave that aside because those arguments fall on deaf ears if you're convinced that what we need to do is ratchet down the economy. And so that has been kind of the argument. So if you saw the commentary yesterday, I know Karen put up a picture of the UK Climate Assembly, and I quote quoted from that particular assembly there in England, in which one speaker noted that in order to deal with the threat of the virus, government had to act because they had no choice in the matter. So then they go on to say, look, if they could actually shut down the economy and lock down the economy over the pandemic, certainly something even greater as a danger was what? Climate change. And so this is a model for what we can do in the future. Then in the third paragraph, I quote from a UN climate chief who actually proposed that government should converge solutions, at least the financial solutions to the coronavirus, to the financial solutions for climate. She also then went on to actually warn we cannot afford to do this is to jump from the frying pan of COVID into the raging fire of climate change. In other words, if this is what we had to do for COVID, we can't just stop doing this. We need to accelerate this and do this on a regular basis. Now, the problem for many of these individuals proposing this is they're hoping that Americans, or in the case of those in the UK, British subjects, will willingly go along with this. It's questionable how much those in Britain or the European Union will go along, but we already have some pretty good facts and figures to say that Americans, on the one hand, say they're concerned about climate change, but on the other hand, really don't want to pay for it. And let's just look at this real quickly because I give you some of the material and some of the quotes so that you can check it out for yourself. Because Americans, as I said before, in one of the surveys actually say that they want to actually deal with this. And so the Washington Post survey actually asked them what they would be willing to pay. Okay, if you go back and look at the numbers that many people are generating right now, and I tend to accept those, the Competitive Enterprise Institute and others, most of them say that right now the Biden administration, essentially with what they want to do with the various expenditures and taxes, are essentially saying that they want each American to pay $1,500 per year for these climate change initiatives. So if you have a family of four, well, then that's 15 times 4. And you can recognize that we start getting up to about $6,000 a year for a family of 4. But anyway, $1,500 per American. So are Americans willing to spend up to $1,500 a year to address the issue of climate change? And the answer to that would be no. Washington Post survey discovered that half of the population would be unwilling to pay any more than $24 a year. So you hear a lot of people saying they're concerned about climate change and, yeah, we need to spend money. But as soon as you start saying, well, we need you to spend your money, they go, oh, no, I'm not interested in that. But more importantly, even though people say that they believe climate change is an issue, when you ask them what are some of the biggest issues that we need to address, and these came up during the campaign, there was no lack of candidates talking about climate change, at least on the Democratic side, right? Would you agree with that? There was certainly no hesitation on the part of both, at that time, candidate Joe Biden, candidate Kamala Harris, and others talking about that. And yet, interestingly enough, the most recent Gallup poll actually found that while a quarter of the American population cited the pandemic as an important issue, only 3% mentioned climate change and the environment as their key concern. So for those who were making a very significant argument, and at least two very prominent Democrats this time last year were still making the case that this is the number one issue facing the world, you can only get about 3% of the American voters who said, yeah, it's really number one issue. And so this is, I think, going to be the great challenge. Now, that brings me to my final point, and we'll move on, and that is one European economist looking at the numbers for the UK, looking at that for the European Union, probably even looking across the ocean at America, finally said, we're going to need some certain degree of eco-dictatorship. in order for this to be implemented. And so at a time when I think people are very weary of the pandemic lockdowns and the COVID lockdowns, I think they're even less likely to endorse and embrace climate lockdowns. And yet, of course, that may be the first step in what I call environmental coercion. So that's one of those issues that we have talked about here on Point of View. We will come back to that issue of climate change, and maybe even tomorrow with Dr. Merrill Matthews, who has been over the years quite an expert on healthcare, but began to diversify a couple of years ago and has become quite an expert as well on energy policy. We'll talk to him about some of these infrastructure items as well as the push towards climate change. But just before we take a break, let me just mention that I was talking about media bias. And next week, I do have a commentary coming out called Fairness. And the reason I bring it out is because the fact that Lester Holt, if you're not familiar with him, he's the anchor for NBC News, recently ended one of his broadcasts by making a statement that he felt that fairness is overrated. He said the idea that we should always give two sides equal weight and merit should not reflect the world we find ourselves in. And so this was a little bit shocking, but here's how he justified it. He said that the sun sets in the west is a fact, and any contrary view does not deserve our time and attention. Okay, that's a trivial example. Does anybody disagree that the sun sets in the west? No. Okay, then he goes on to say, though, decisions to not give unsupported arguments equal time are not a dereliction of journalistic responsibility or some kind of agenda. In fact, it's just the opposite. Well, that claim by Lester Holt was a little too much for Brit Hume. He's, of course, been with ABC News for decades and now with Fox News. And on Twitter, he said, this argument rests on the proposition that the media always knows the truth. But they don't, as his own network's coverage of the bogus and implausible Russian collusion tale illustrates, not to mention the media's reporting of early COVID-19 advice that turned out to be wrong. So in a next tweet, he said, if one side says the White House is made of powdered milk and the other disagrees, we can safely ignore the milk claim. But political disputes, Brit Hume says, are rarely so cut and dried. So we report what both sides are saying and let viewers and readers make up their own minds. And I think, we can all certainly agree that we don't need to provide an alternative viewpoint as to whether or not the sun sets in the west or whether the White House is made of powdered milk. But the argument is now being used by the major media to simply say you don't deserve and don't need to hear alternative views on things ranging from the pandemic lockdowns to climate change, the topics I just addressed a minute ago. They believe that fairness is overrated, and if nothing else, they will exclude all sorts of important pieces of information if it doesn't fit their narrative. So we should recognize that we're going to need more discernment. One of the themes we've used so often here, when you have major media personalities saying, we really don't have to present the other side because we all know that the sun sets in the west. I buy that one, but it's a long jump from sun setting in the west to the fact that we're in a climate change emergency and we need to shut down the economy. Let's take a break. We got a lot more to cover right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
1.5 hour. Let's see if we can talk a little bit more about this infrastructure spending plan. We'll get into a little bit more of that tomorrow when we have, of course, Penna Dexter and Dr. Merrill Matthews. And you will be surprised to find out what is in this plan. And because, again, there's a push to actually spend more money and possibly raise taxes, or if taxes are not raised effectively because of some kind of logjam in Congress, then to have the Federal Reserve to buy these treasuries and the Treasury Department to print more money. They actually don't print it, they just move ones and zeros around. We will be talking a little bit more about that next week. It is, I think, of real concern that many people have about the ongoing national debt, which we place on the backs of our children and grandchildren. But even in the near term, the impact that it has, maybe not initially on inflation, and I'm going to get into that also next week, because the official inflation rate is, of course, the Consumer Price Index. And if you sincerely believe that that's the actual inflation, then you have to say there's something really odd here, because the inflation rate's supposed to be 1%. And did you see how house prices have gone up and car prices have gone up and even food has gone up? And so, again, they use a certain basket, which actually makes the inflation rate look smaller. Now, you might say, why would they want to do that? Well, because, again, these cost of living adjustments that are giving to those of you that are receiving Social Security and various kinds of benefits, or even food stamps or whatever, are all tied to that. So there is a real emphasis on trying to make inflation look lower than it is. But seriously, if you think that printing more and more money, and I put printing in quotes, more money, when we have the same number of goods and services doesn't affect inflation, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But I guarantee what it does is it devalues the dollar, makes the dollar worth less, and that is certainly a concern for you as well. I mean, we've been increasing the money supply in round numbers, and we'll get into more of that next week, by about 5%. Then in last year, guess what? We increased it almost 25%, and you have seen some of the commentaries I've done on that. Now, if the next couple of years we keep increasing it, maybe not at 25%, but even 15%, you can begin to figure the impact that this might have, because ultimately each increase means the dollar is worth less. So let's just assume you set some money aside for retirement. I've done this with people before. Let's say you got $1 million. First of all, I know a lot of you don't, but let's just, for the assumption that maybe you've got that sitting off somewhere, stocks, bonds, whatever, cash, and every year, instead, it's degraded by about 15%. So the first year, it's, you multiply that by 85%, then you multiply that number by 85%, you multiply that number by 85%. Already you're down, you've lost pretty much 40% of the purchasing power of your dollar just over a couple of years. And so this is why people are talking about Bitcoin and gold and all sorts of things. And these conversations are taking place all the time, because just the concern about what the future might bring. So anyway, those, I think, illustrate why many people are looking at this infrastructure spending bill, and first of all saying a lot of it has nothing to do with infrastructure, and second of all, if we keep spending like this after we had to, of course, spend and help individuals whose businesses were destroyed by the lockdown and lives were destroyed by the lockdown, what in the world does that do, not just to our children and grandchildren, but for us in the next 5 or 10 years? So we're going to pay attention to that and recognize that we as Christians need to look at that and need to be wise stewards of our financial resources. And frankly, we need to tell you the truth, because there almost seems to be an unwillingness to talk about the obvious economic implications of some of this. But let's get back to the infrastructure bill for just a minute. David Ditch with the Daily Signal, that is a group associated with the Heritage Foundation, always done a very good job. And they point out that on the heels of this $1.9 trillion spending package, now we have an attempt, again, by this administration to figure out how to spend more money. And so they have 9 things you need to know about the spending plan, and I'll go through the 9 before we take a break real quickly. Number 1, dishonest advertising. The argument here is that only 5% of the spending goes to roads and bridges. First of all, I would agree with that, but at the same time, I'd also want to be fair to recognize that some other things that we would think might be associated with infrastructure would bring the number up to a little bit more than 5%, but nevertheless, I can't find anybody that's arguing that a majority has anything to do with infrastructure, and so we understand what that is. Number two, the $2.75 trillion tax hike, which, again, don't believe that's going to happen, but let's assume that some of that happens. First of all, he points out that this would dramatically increase taxes on businesses, primarily by boosting the corporate income tax from 21% to 28%. And this would be, again, the biggest tax hike since Lyndon Johnson. And if you think that that is going to be helpful to businesses struggling right now after the lockdown, you are very naive indeed. And if you also think that, well, the corporations are going to pay for it and you're not, I think we've explained that enough for you as well. Number three, they say big spending won't deliver promised job creation. They point out about the fact that we've had a very poor track record of using infrastructure to increase employment. You might remember, if you have a good memory, when the president at that time, Barack Obama, kind of sheepishly acknowledged that the so-called shovel-ready projects weren't as shovel-ready as he thought they might be. Number four, federal takeover of local responsibilities. I'm going to get into that more in just a minute, but here a lot of this goes for school construction, water lines, pedestrian safety, and all the rest. Those might be considered infrastructure, but as you start looking at this, it says that the government is actually going to take that over. It's called the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. And that is, if the federal government is distributing this money, you have to follow their mandates. And if you haven't figured out right now that some of the things that this administration wants to force you to do, now that they have the carrot, that is the funding, and maybe even the stick of some kinds of regulations, that it just allows the federal government to take over your state and local communities in ways that probably you would not necessarily support. Number five, it undercuts businesses by micromanaging economic development. The spending of billions of dollars on private initiatives, for example, broadband, electrical grid, housing, and those kinds of things, as worthwhile as that might be, nevertheless, it actually is competing with those individuals that have maybe wanted to raise venture capital to do that. And that, again, puts it into the hands of kind of federal control of all of those areas. Number six, $600 billion in corporate welfare and tax credits. This is listed as job creation, but I think we know that whether it's welfare for the poor or welfare for corporations, we got some questions about that. Number seven, over $400 billion in welfare and health spending. Again, if indeed this was an up or down vote, you know it wouldn't probably pass, but because it's stuck in with the infrastructure that allows for all sorts of things to happen. A lot of it has to do with everything from Medicaid expansion to the VA and a variety of others, which I won't go into. Two more. Number eight, wasteful $165 billion handout for transit and Amtrak. If there's one thing you can always assume, it's Amtrak is going to lose money. It is heavily subsidized, and there it goes again. And one more. This illustrates kind of the Green New Deal. There's $174 billion, $174 billion in subsidies for electric vehicles. Now, again, you would hope that a free market would eventually produce those, but now you have subsidies to actually produce those. And until we figure out a way to actually provide energy to those electric vehicles that isn't burning fossil fuel, it's just pretending that we're actually addressing the issue of climate change. It's simply saying, since I don't see where the energy comes from, I won't necessarily be concerned about that. Yes, some people do power their electric vehicles in places like the Pacific Northwest, where it comes from hydroelectric power or geothermal power. Some cases from solar, but not much, and a few from maybe wind turbines, wind power, but most of it still comes from burning fossil fuel, of sending it down lines where there's a great deal of energy inefficiency, and eventually
making you feel good by plugging in your electric car. If nothing else, 9 things you need to know about the infrastructure spending plan. We'll probably get into some of that tomorrow with Dr. Merrill Matthews because he has done the research on it and will remind us that we're spending a lot of money. We're not going to get much of a bang for the buck. If anything, it's just going to take our existing problems and probably make them worse. But we'll talk about that tomorrow. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Let me start this section by asking this question, probably a better way to say it, and that is, do you think it's good to have single-family dwellings? Well, of course you do. Would you be concerned if there was a push to actually prevent the zoning of single-family dwellings? I would think the answer to that would also be yes. And that's another reason to be concerned with this $2.5 trillion infrastructure bill. And this comes from Stanley Kurtz. Now, Stanley Kurtz is an individual that I've quoted quite often because he is doing such good research. I think I first started quoting him when we were talking about homosexuality, some of the gender reassignment issues and all the rest. I think back then he was with the Hudson Institute. He's written for the National Review. He's now at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And his piece, which just came out from National Review, which is entitled, Biden's Infrastructure Bill Aims to End Single-Family Zoning. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this campaign claim,
you weren't paying attention during the campaign last year, because it's been pretty intriguing. Because indeed, during the campaign, candidate Joe Biden did talk about this, and it came up quite often. As a matter of fact, Stanley Kurtz puts it this way: if you think this issue was debated and resolved during the 2020 presidential campaign, you are mistaken. It's true that Biden's campaign platform openly and unmistakably pledged to abolish single-family zoning. But as soon as President Trump made an issue of that pledge, Biden then went silent on the issue. Of course, if nothing else, Biden was silent on a lot of issues, and the press pretty much ignored it and simply said that's not something he designed. But now you are starting to see a push in that direction again. Okay, so Stanley Kurtz asked a couple of good questions. How exactly does the proposed infrastructure bill put forward by President Joe Biden and his administration plan to end single-family zoning? And the argument, if you look at the fact sheet, which is available through the White House, actually says, and I'm quoting, Biden is calling on Congress to enact an innovative new competitive grant program that awards flexible and attractive funding to jurisdictions that take concrete steps to eliminate, and then exclusionary zoning. Actually, there's some other words there, so you have to find that, but that's really what they're talking about there. And so basically what they're doing is providing a carrot, and that is grant money as kind of bait for various individuals. And so if a county or a municipality wants to weaken or even eliminate single-family zoning, it gets federal funds. Are you with me on this? So it's, of course, an attempt to try to say, we just can't afford to have any more single-family zoning laws because, after all, we have too much population. We're trying to push towards the Green New Deal. We need to put people into multiple family dwellings that are energy efficient. You kind of know where the argument's going there. And if nothing else, this is an attempt to go back to something that came up during the Obama administration. We've talked about this before, but again, it's been 5 years, so let's get into it. And that is, during the Obama-Biden administration, you had what was called Affirmative Furthering Fair Housing, AFFH, regulations. And so this was an attempt to, again, try to encourage less single-family zoning laws in an effort to do that. And so this was through, at that time, community development block grants and things of that nature, making it harder for suburbs to resist applying for those federal grants. So the question you might have here is, are federal carrots like this enough? And that's the next question that Stanley Kurtz addresses. He says prosperous suburbs, maybe just forego the grants in an effort to keep independent from federal mandates. But the success of the initiative depends in part on exactly how much money gets allocated to the grants tied to zoning reform. Of course, the details have not been released yet, but you already can see that you have $213 billion, which are allocated in that direction. And I mentioned those just a few minutes ago. Now, Stanley Kurtz raises another question. If there aren't enough carrots, how about sticks? In other words, it's one thing to entice people to change their zoning laws so they receive federal grants, but maybe they say, well, I don't really want to change those, and I'll just forego getting those federal grants. Well, during the campaign, the candidate, Joe Biden, backed a plan to withhold federal transportation grants for road repair from suburbs that refuse to kill off single-family zoning. Now, that has not been proposed, to be fair, has not been proposed by the Biden administration, and Stanley Kurtz says there's a very good reason for that. He says Democrats don't yet have the votes to pass such a law. The only way they could do so would be to get around the filibuster, is to actually have spending laws that are under what's called reconciliation, which right now has been used, might be used again, but probably not. So for now, Stanley Kurtz says, it's carrots all the way down. If, however, he says, the Democrats in the Senate expand their majority, that is, they win the next election, or they kill the filibuster, then the outcome could be all sticks all the way down, and there goes suburban zoning. So this is just a reminder that some of the things that are lurking in this bill are going to have an impact even in the communities where you live, because after all, the federal government is still providing tremendous number of grants to individuals. And so if you're listening to this right now and you're saying, well, I hate to see what the federal government's doing, but that's fine. I'm on the city council. I'm a mayor. I might even be a state legislator. It's not going to affect me. This particular bill could possibly be used to actually end or significantly curtail what is called single-family zoning. And you're probably going to hear more about that in the future, but I suspect you probably heard about it for the very first time right here on Point of View. And it's one more reason to pay attention to a piece of legislation that started out at $2 trillion. Do I hear $2.5 trillion sold? How about $3 trillion, $4 trillion, somewhere along the line? It's going to get to be real money, but it's more than just the money. It is the attempt to actually implement some of the things that were part of the campaign that now are starting to surface here months after the inauguration of Joe Biden. And you will start seeing those if you read the fine print of some of these bills that are in front of Congress. That's why we're talking about these things here on Point of View. Let me mention one last time that we do have an opportunity for you to contact your 2 United States senators about the Equality Act. Next week, we're probably going to change that out and focus on something else that you can do to contact some of those members of Congress. My Viewpoints commentary today is on Apocalypse Never. And if you find yourself saying, you've been mentioning all sorts of articles, I really want to read them for myself, because in every case, I'm giving you brief summaries. So as you go to the website, you can see a little bit more about how the 60 Minutes smear gets worse. A very good piece by a liberal, a very obvious liberal, who nevertheless is calling for his fellow liberals to believe in free speech. And then the one on, is everything infrastructure? Well, at least one U.S. senator thinks it is. And that gets us back to the bill we've been talking about here today. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. I hope you will join us tomorrow. It is our weekend edition. Looking forward to getting this roundtable together. Most importantly, I want to thank Andrew for his help behind the scenes, and for Steve. Have a great day. We will see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees, and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information